Welcome to the Hillsdale College Online Courses Podcast. I am Jeremiah Regan.
And I'm Juan. We are back with the Federalist. On to lecture number 6 today, the House of Representatives. We mentioned at the beginning when we started this course that the 85 different papers that were published over the course of a few months from October through May.
Yeah, October of 87 through May of 88. Pretty remarkable that they got all of those out in that short time period.
Yeah, that's right. And we mentioned that they were planned as a book. They were not just individual essays that were published, but it was planned. It was a cohesive book. And we start seeing that now. In the beginning, lectures 1 through 5 that we've covered, we see much more the theory-based part of the book, why you needed a union, the arguments from human nature.
Problems with the Articles of Confederation.
That's right. Yeah. And now we start seeing much more changing to the institutions. And that's what we're going to see in this one, the House of Representatives.
So what do you mean by institution?
Right. So the institutions that you need in the government.
So the actual structure of the Constitution.
That's right.
And why it's constituted the way it is.
Yeah. And so the House of Representatives, the Senate, why do you have two different chambers in a Congress, the president, the courts, like why are they designed the way they are? And of course, we're starting now with the House of Representatives.
What we see with the House is it is the most responsive and closest to the people of all the institutions of the federal government. And that's on one hand necessary for a Republican government. We have to have a way for the people to express their will. It's also a little bit dangerous because sometimes the people do things that are silly. We know human nature from even earlier in this course, on top of our own experience in life, that men are ambitious, vindictive, and rapacious. So how can we trust the people with this power? And I'll read a quick quote from Federalist 55 that Dr. Pestritto mentions in the course. He says, and this is Madison writing as Publius, "As there is a degree of depravity in mankind which requires a certain degree of circumspection and distrust, so there are other qualities in human nature which justify a certain portion of esteem and confidence. Republican government presupposes the existence of these qualities in a higher degree than any other form. Were the pictures which have been drawn by the political jealousy of some among us faithful likenesses of the human character, the inference would be that there is not sufficient virtue among men for self-government, and that nothing less than the chains of despotism can restrain them from destroying and devouring one another." So in these papers about the House of Representatives, we see the balance between giving the people voice and allowing their will to lead the government, but also some auxiliary precautions that will help prevent the people from harming themselves with temporary passions or mistakes that they might make.
Yeah, and so we're going to see that the House of Representatives ends up being, from everything that the government that the founders build, the most democratic in the sense that the most responsive to the, let's say, the passions of the people, the will of the people of all the institutions of government.
That's right. In order to help you continue learning about our great nation, it's good to go back to our roots. And we've had the privilege of being able to produce a series of videos that commemorate the 250th anniversary of our nation, talking about events in the Revolutionary War, the signing of the Declaration of Independence, the formation of the Army, and others with Hillsdale scholars and other notable Americans.
And you can watch these videos by going to hillsdale.edu/Story of America. That's hillsdale.edu/Story of America. You'll find all the videos that we currently have and are producing more. They tell some of the key moments during 1775, what was going on in the country leading up to the signing of the Declaration of Independence. So we encourage you to go to hillsdale.edu/Story of America to watch these videos.
Now let's turn to Lecture 6 of the Federalist, the House of Representatives.
In our last session, we talked at some length about the Federalist account of human nature. And we talked about how sober it was, how realistic it was. And we talked about papers like number 6 and number 51 and number 10. And what's emphasized about human nature in those papers? It's ambitious, it's vindictive, it's rapacious. Those are the three words used in number 6. In number 51, Madison talks about pitting ambition against ambition. In number 10, we're reminded that the causes of faction are sown in the very nature of man. We can't change that. That's just part of the way we are. That passionate element of our nature is always going to be there. Often, the only papers that are taught are numbers 10 and 51. Now, those are important papers, and certainly that account of human nature is not an inaccurate account, but it's also not the complete picture. We have to remember that the Federalist is a long book, and numbers 10 and 51 and other papers which emphasize the nastier side of human nature, they're a part of that, but they're only a small part. There's a higher side to Publius's account of human nature. Remember, the human being is made up of both passion and reason. From some accounts you hear of the Federalist Papers, you might think that the Federalists themselves pointed to numbers 10 and 51 as the key to their secret teaching. But of course, that's not true. That focus on 10 and 51, that focus on the nastiness of human nature as we see it depicted in the Federalist, that's really the consequence of scholarship coming in the 20th century. The other side of the story about human nature, that the people have reason as well as passion, is critical in a republic. If you think about the Declaration of Independence, the Declaration says human beings are entitled to self-government. Well, why are they entitled to self-government? The lower beastly creation isn't entitled to self-government, but we are. Why is that? Well, we're created with a unique nature, and we have certain rights and duties that come with that nature. Because our nature is created with not just a passionate element, but with a rational element, it means we are entitled to govern ourselves. And if we lose sight of that in thinking about the argument of the Federalist, we really have lost sight of the purpose of the entire book. In fact, we've lost sight of the reason for which the revolution was fought in the first place. So if we bear in mind this fuller account of the human being, this more rational element of the human being that the framers thought made us unique and different from the beasts, what does that mean for how the government was constructed? We know on the one hand that the design from the framers relied on human self-interestedness. We learned that especially in talking about Federalist 51, where Madison says, this is just the way human beings are. They are ambitious. They are self-interested. We're going to use that to our advantage. We're going to pit different parts of the government against one another so that that competition will be a safeguard over the public rights. And certainly that's a critical part of understanding the Federalists' political science. But also remember that at the end of that description in 51, Madison reminds us these mechanisms, as useful as he hopes they will be, are mere auxiliary precautions. In other words, they're meant to assist in temporary moments, but they cannot be something that substitutes for the fundamental dependence on the people. As Madison wrote in Federalist 51, a dependence on the people is no doubt the primary control on government. When one considers that a dependence on the people is the primary control on government, it should be no surprise then that in the mind of the Federalists, the most important institution was the House of Representatives. This was the institution that was to be closest to the people, and it's the institution to which Publius points over and over when he responds to charges that the national government might be too powerful or might be a danger to the people. In the papers from the Federalist on the House of Representatives, we see Publius's dependence on the rational part of human nature come out very strongly. One such paper is number 55, and this comes in a series of papers where Publius is defending the design of the House of Representatives against critiques from the anti-Federalists that it's insufficient to represent public opinion. And in the case of number 55, the particular objection that he is looking at is the concern that the House of Representatives is too small relative to the size of the country's population. And the argument is, and it's certainly not a bad argument, that if the number of representatives is too small and the size of the country is too large, how can you really say that such a small number of people can adequately represent the opinions and the views of so many citizens? In particular, in number 55, Publius addresses himself to the concern that the members of the House might become corrupt, that they might forget their obligations, that they might not be faithful to the public trust. And Publius makes a very simple response to that. This is why we have elections, he says. The people themselves are responsible for who gets elected to the House of Representatives, and so we should worry about corruption in the House only if we need to worry about the corruption of the people themselves. This basic point, that if the people are good, so too will be their representatives, is a reflection of this second and higher part of Publius's estimation of human nature. And this leads Publius to make an essential general observation at the end of Federalist number 55. He's addressing himself to those who worry that the people will continually re-elect unfaithful members to the House of Representatives. And he says about those people that the sincere friends of liberty who give themselves up to the extravagancies of this passion are not aware of the injury they do their own cause. As there is a degree of depravity in mankind, which requires a certain degree of circumspection and distrust. That part we've learned a lot about already in the Federalist, right? There is that passionate lower side of human nature, and we're going to be very sober about that and cautious about that. So Publius says, okay, there is that certain part of human nature. But then he goes on to say, so there are other qualities in human nature which justify a certain portion of esteem and confidence. Republican government presupposes the existence of these qualities in a higher degree than any other form. In other words, in a republic, you have to believe that there's a rational side of human nature, or there's no point in trying to establish a republic in the first place. He goes on to conclude Federalist 55. Were the pictures which have been drawn by the political jealousy of some among us faithful likenesses of the human character, the inference would be that there is not sufficient virtue among men for self-government, and that nothing less than the chains of despotism can restrain them from destroying and devouring one another. Now, clearly that's not what Publius believes, that's not what the framers believe, that's not what the signers of the Declaration of Independence believe. They don't believe that man is completely depraved. If they did, they would be subscribers to political thinkers like Thomas Hobbes, for example, who thought only an absolute despotism could control human beings given their depraved nature. But the framers reject that view. They think there's this higher element, and their republic rests upon it. Publius goes on in these papers in the House of Representatives to talk about the specific ways that the people can keep up their vigilance. He's relying on them to be vigilant, to watch over the people whom they have elected, to make sure that these people are staying faithful to their trust. And he says there are lots of ways that this can work if you look at the design of the legislature as a whole and of the House of Representatives in particular. Several of his papers make this case. I would point to number 57 to give you some specifics. Publius emphasizes what should be a very obvious point. We have elections. Elections are important. And the fact that we have relatively frequent elections for the House of Representatives gives the people ample opportunity to supervise their representatives and gives the representatives themselves all kinds of proper motives for good conduct. Among other things, Publius points out, first of all, that it's in the interest of the representatives to maintain their position. There's a certain kind of honor that comes with being in that position of public trust, and human beings like honor. And they'll want to do the kinds of things that will allow them to continue to receive the public trust and to continue along in these positions of honor. Frequent elections are, of course, an essential check. This, by the way, is an argument against term limits on any elected office holder. If somebody is elected for a term and he knows that it's not going to be a question at the end whether or not he gets to continue in office, well, what's the incentive for good behavior? And Publius, by the way, makes the exact same point when he talks about the president. This is in Federalist number 72. One of the big arguments against presidential term limits is to say, well, then what's the incentive for proper behavior once the president knows he's term limited out? Finally, and one of the most important points, I think, in number 57, that in a republic we have a regime that operates on the principle of the rule of law. By that he means not only are we, the citizens, subject to the laws that the representatives make, but the representatives themselves are subject to those laws. They have to live under them. They have to feel their effect in the very same way that everybody else does. And surely that should be some kind of guarantee against a tyrannical law. The representative has as much interest in not being tyrannized by the law as anybody else does. And that last point is critical. It helps to remind us that the people are in charge in a republic. And if they get bad government, it's only because they deserve bad government. And Publius has a particular example in mind dealing with this theme of the rule of law. He says, there are some regimes where the officials get to make laws and then exempt themselves from feeling the effects of those laws. What if our representatives tried to do that? And Publius says, well, why on earth would any rational people, any people of decent character, allow their government to make laws and then to exempt itself from the effect of those laws? If you get to that point, the people themselves are to blame. And this is how he puts it in Federalist 57. If it be asked, what is to restrain the House of Representatives from making legal discriminations in favor of themselves and a particular class of society? I answer, the genius of the whole system, the nature of just and constitutional laws, and above all, the vigilant and manly spirit which actuates the people of America, a spirit which nourishes freedom and in return is nourished by it. In other words, what is to restrain the House of Representatives? It's the people themselves, it's their vigilance, it's their rationality, it's their ability to understand when their liberties are threatened and to change their officials if that's going on. And here's what Publius says next. If this spirit shall ever be so far debased as to tolerate a law not obligatory on the legislature as well as on the people, then the people will be prepared to tolerate anything but liberty. In other words, if your legislature is making laws that are unjust, that violate the principle of equal rights for all citizens, that's not really on the legislature, that's on you. And if you have that going on in a republic, the people themselves need to fundamentally change their character and take action. When we think about that important point, and then when we reflect on the fact that Congress today regularly exempts itself from laws that it enacts, that is a very sobering thought. If the House of Representatives is so important, so central to the framers' design of our system, then what are the key principles of that design? Well, first of all, the design of the House of Representatives is that it's part of what we call a bicameral legislature, a legislature with two houses, a House and a Senate. And we will be taking up the Senate in later sessions of this course. Probably you've learned that our bicameral design came as a result of a compromise at the Constitutional Convention. And that's certainly true as far as it goes. It compromised the interests of small states and large states. Large states wanted representation based on population. Small states wanted equal representation for each state in the legislature. And so there was a compromise made, and the Senate reflects the interests of the small states and the House of large states. That's perfectly straightforward, but it doesn't paint the whole picture. And the Federalists were insistent that even though that design came out of a compromise at the convention, there were also very principled reasons for it, that bicameralism really does help to further the most important aims of our Constitution.
It's no secret that Americans are more divided than ever. And it's not just over what policies will improve our great country. No, it's over whether America is great at all, whether America deserves our love. That's why Imprimis is so important. Imprimis looks at the issues of the day from a constitutional perspective, reminding citizens always of our great heritage of liberty. For more than 50 years, Imprimis has featured speeches from the smartest conservative thinkers and writers at Hillsdale events. These days, Hillsdale publishes people like Molly Hemingway, Andy Puzder, Harmeet Dillon, and Chris Rufo. Over 6.4 million American households and businesses receive Imprimis absolutely free. And I urge you to sign up for it today at no charge. To get your free lifetime subscription, go to hillsdale.edu/lifetime right now.
When we look at the papers on the House of Representatives and later on the Senate, we get the clear sense that Publius is trying to create a delicate balance within the legislature. And he's trying to balance two important aims that can often be in tension with one another. On the one hand, we want the legislature to be representative. We want it to actually reflect what the people themselves want done in their government. And so it has to be very close to the people. It has to be very responsive to public opinion. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, we do want our legislature to be stable. We don't want it changing around all the time, willy-nilly. We don't want it to be like what was going on in many of the states, if you remember Madison's complaints about state legislatures that we've talked about. We want there to be competence among the legislators. We want them to have some experience in office to be able to do their jobs well. The other fundamental balance we want is we want that closeness to public opinion. We want that immediate effect of public opinion, because after all, that's what self-government is. But we want the public's reason to rule. Remember that critical understanding of representation from Federalist 10, that when the public voice is pronounced by the representative institution, it's supposed to be more consonant to the public good than if the people themselves just kind of assembled immediately in mass form. And so that balance between immediate public opinion and long-term, cool, sober reason, that also is a balance that they're trying to get to come out of the bicameral system. As Publius explains in Federalist 52, the House of Representatives is the part of the system, it's the part of the bicameral design that is supposed to be most dependent on the people. It's supposed to be that part of the institution that is most responsive to public opinion. This is how he puts it. As it is essential to liberty that the government in general should have a common interest with the people, so it is particularly essential that the branch of it under consideration should have an immediate dependence on and an intimate sympathy with the people. So that's the key concept for the House: immediate dependence on the people, an intimate sympathy with the people. Well, how do you achieve that? There's only one way you achieve that: through elections, and in particular with the House of Representatives, through frequent elections. Having said we need frequent elections for the House, this begs the obvious question: how frequent is frequent? We might think the elections that we have every 2 years are pretty frequent. They always seem to be coming around. However, you may be surprised to know that from the Anti-Federalist point of view, this was far too long between elections. The great Anti-Federalist saying here that Publius is trying to address is, where annual elections end, tyranny begins. In other words, if you don't have an election at least once a year, this means the representatives can run amok in that long period of time between elections. And so in Federalist number 53, Publius turns his attention to arguing that every 2 years is frequent enough. And in 53, you get a sense that even within the House of Representatives, Publius is trying to create a little balance there too. On the one hand, you want what he said must be an intimate sympathy with the people, but you also want to give the representatives some length of time in office, some ability to learn the system, some ability to gain some experience, especially at the federal level, where the matters that they will be dealing with are not simply things that they will have knowledge of from their own local circumstance. Publius says there are two kinds of knowledge that are needed to be a good representative. One kind of knowledge, the first kind of knowledge, he says, can come from things we come to know in our ordinary private lives. Just by being a citizen, by being involved in commerce or agriculture, we can come to this first kind of knowledge. The second kind of knowledge, however, is, I suppose, what we would call on-the-job experience. How to be a legislator, how to navigate the legislative process. And that's the kind of knowledge that can only come from spending some time on the job. You want the terms to be long enough to accumulate this second kind of knowledge. The importance of giving representatives some length of time in office is also a way that Publius thinks we can address the problem of long-term incumbency. Now, this is a concern that many of us have with our politics today, that you have members of long-standing who are around for a long time, they know how to game the system, and they're there just perpetuating themselves in office. Now, Publius is not naive about politicians. This is a lesson that one gets again and again reading through this book carefully. He knows exactly the character of politicians and how they're prone to be self-interested and how they'll try to game the system to benefit themselves and create advantages for themselves. Sometimes we think that the framers must have had this kind of pie-in-the-sky view of politicians, and that we've only come to learn later how self-interested politicians could be. But nothing could be further from the truth. This is what Publius says in Federalist 53 about this phenomenon. A few of the members, as happens in all such assemblies, will possess superior talents, will, by frequent re-elections, become members of long standing, will be thoroughly masters of the public business, and perhaps not unwilling to avail themselves of those advantages. So you're going to have long-term incumbents. They're going to learn how to game the system. They're going to take advantage of that. He understands this. This happens in every kind of assembly, in every kind of legislature. Well, what do we do about that? Do we impose term limits? Do we impose limits on the choice that people can make in elections? Do we let the people say, stop me before I vote again? No, of course not. What you try to do is to give the new members the ability to gain experience on the job so that they can compete with these members of long standing. Publius goes on to say this in Federalist 53. The greater the proportion of new members and the less the information of the bulk of the members, the more apt will they be to fall into the snares that may be laid for them. So these long-term incumbents are going to lay snares. They're going to try to take advantage of the new members, and that's fine. That's to be expected. What do you do about that? You give them some time on the job. You give them time to gain experience, to gain information, so that they can be on a relatively equal footing. And by the way, the same general principle can be made about the relationship between members of the House to members of the Senate. Remember, Senate terms are very long, 6 years. And so if you make the House terms too short, then the Senate will have a massive advantage over the members of the House of Representatives. So Publius's message to us in these papers on the House of Representatives is that it is the core institution of what we today call our democracy. It's the institution through which the people can exercise control over their government, and its design in our Constitution reflects that fact. This is why the design of the House of Representatives under the Constitution is very different than how the national legislature was designed under the Articles of Confederation. And that criticism of the Articles is going to be discussed in our next session of the course.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Hillsdale College Online Courses Podcast. If you want to continue learning, please visit hillsdale.edu/course. There, you will find over 40 free online courses including Ancient Christianity, the Genesis story, classic children's literature, and many more. The courses include additional readings, study guides, fully produced videos, and you can chat with your fellow students on a dedicated forum. Upon completing a course, you will also get a certificate. All our courses are free because we believe that what you'll learn will enrich your life and that a virtuous citizen is the best defense for liberty. So pursue the education necessary for freedom and happiness at hillsdale.edu/course today. That's hillsdale.edu/course. Thanks for listening.